All right, I know we've all heard the saying, there are two things that are certain in life. Death and taxes. I hate to bring up the last one if that's a sore subject right now for anyone under the gun. Well, that's a saying, they say there's, two things certain. Well, they don't always know for sure exactly. And I'm not denying that those two things are certain, but I would say, are there only two things that are certain? If you thought about it, would you add anything to that list? That there's more things in life that are certain than just death and taxes. Kathy. Christ will come again. There we go. Any other certainties in life? Trouble? God and Jesus are certain. Disappointment, that'll happen. Yeah, it doesn't say if. It says when you experience trials, they're going to happen. One of them that came to my mind, and I'm almost reluctant at times to start thinking about some subject because God always seems to, illustrate it in some ways. And the one that comes to my mind is whenever you have two people or more in a relationship, there's going to be an offense. There's going to be one person does something that upsets the other person. It's just guaranteed in any kind of close relationship at all. And I look at things and I realize, I've had to apologize to each member of my immediate family this week for something, some way I've offended them, done something. It's just a certainty. And so with that it's certain that there's going to be an offense if you have, two or more people in any sort of close relationship. Well, then there's a need for forgiveness. There's a need because it's not just I'll do it to them. They're going to do something that offends me, that upsets me, and I've got to forgive them or else the relationship is going to suffer or maybe just end altogether. That's a certainty when you have those relationships. I remember when I was in a Sunday school class, and I was a member of the Sunday school class, and I was in this class with all these young married couples, and I was their age, but I was the only one that wasn't married in the entire class. And the teacher was an older guy who was teaching, and he asked the class, what do we want to look at next? We're coming to the end of some book or some study. He went around, and almost every one of the couples was saying resolving conflict in marriage. And I thought, wow, really? Maybe I should be glad. It's just inevitable when you have two people in any kind of, again, a close relationship. It's going to take place. And there's also the side of that when someone does offend me, if I don't forgive them, it affects me. It really does something to me if I start harboring unforgiveness and bitterness. So that's why the title today is This We Have to Get. There's some things we may never get in life, about the Bible even, but this subject today, and we're going to see how deep it goes, we have to get this. And we're looking at the end of Matthew 18, and the context for this, the beginning, you remember the disciples are asking this question to Jesus. Who then is the greatest in the kingdom of heaven? And we see in another one of the Gospels, they weren't just asking in general, they're arguing about themselves. I think it's me. I've done this. I think it's me. Who then's the greatest? And Jesus has to really clarify their thinking. It's not just to, inform them. He has to totally wipe the slate clean to start with. And he says, unless you become like a little child, you won't even enter the kingdom of heaven. Unless you humble yourself. It's those who humble themselves like a little child, they're the greatest in the kingdom. And we said there's two aspects of humility that come into play. And the first one is that part that wipes the slate clean. It's being aware of my limitations. What I can't do, or in this case, really, what I don't know, and don't even know I don't know. And so Jesus, these disciples, he knew what was in their mind. It was all these physical characteristics, just the world's typical idea of what makes a person great. And Jesus says, you've got to wipe all that away. And be aware that you don't know at this point. And then he tells them, and the other side of humility that comes into play is putting others first. And the Bible talks about this a lot, honoring someone else above yourself. Look to the interest of others. And Jesus then goes on to give all these examples that are really specific ways that we can put others first. And when he says, beware that you don't do anything that causes someone else, another Christian, to stumble, to sin, and harms, interferes with their relationship with God. So don't allow it in your own life either, because, for your sake and for theirs, he reminds them of how God loves each and every person, the parable of the sheep that goes away, and the 1 out of 100, and the shepherd goes and looks for it. And then he talks about the idea, if one of your fellow Christians does get caught in sin, try to restore them. Whether the sin is sin in general or maybe a sin against you, and go to a lot of effort. We don't like that. We'd rather not do it maybe, but he says, no, put them first, their will, their welfare, spiritual health, and do what it takes to help restore them. Well, that brings up a question then that Peter asks, and this is where we're going to start today, verse 21. Peter came to Jesus and asked, Lord, how many times shall I forgive my brother or sister who sins against me? Up to 7 times? Jesus answered, I tell you, not 7 times, but 77 times. I was reminded, I read this article this week, and it had a quote by Bob Vernon, who was the former assistant police chief of Los Angeles. And apparently a Christian man, and his observation about Christians fit in with this. He said, most Christians are satisfied to stay 10 degrees above the world in terms of morality, and imagine themselves being holy as God intends them to be because of that. That's his experience. You have the world and their standard of morality. He says, most Christians, they know that's wrong. They think if I can just be 10 degrees above that, 10 degrees better, then I'm holy. I'm doing what God wants. Well, Peter was, matter of fact, Peter went a lot further, because in his day, the Jewish teachers said you need to forgive someone 3 times. So my math's not always good, and especially that whole percentage thing. But I think, 7, double it, add 1, that's like 133% better. I mean, that's pretty far above the world. And Jesus says, no, that's not it. And it goes back. What he's really doing is he's illustrating the principle we saw in the Sermon on the Mount, where he said, you need to be perfect as God is perfect. Don't look at the world and say, I'm better than them. Now, here's the standard, and we'll never be sinless, we'll never be perfect as God, but he says, set that as your bar. Don't set the world as it and think, okay, I'm a little better than them. No, look to God as your standard, and that's what leads into this parable of the unmerciful servant. Look at verse 23. It says, therefore the kingdom of heaven is like a king who wanted to settle accounts with his servants. As he began the settlement, a man who owed him 10,000 bags of gold was brought to him. Since he was not able to pay, the master ordered that he and his wife and children and all that he had be sold to repay the debt. At this, the servant fell on his knees before him. Be patient with me, he begged, and I will pay back everything. The servant's master took pity on him, canceled the debt, and let him go. But when the servant went out, he found one of his fellow servants who owed him 100 silver coins. He grabbed him and began to choke him. Pay back what you owe me, he demanded. His fellow servant fell to his knees and begged him, be patient with me, and I will pay it back. But he refused. Instead, he went off and had the man thrown into prison until he could pay the debt. When the other servants saw what had happened, they were outraged and went and told their master everything that had happened. Then the master called the servant in. You wicked servant, he said. I canceled all that debt of yours because you begged me to. Shouldn't you have had mercy on your fellow servant just as I had on you? In anger, his master handed him over to the jailers to be tortured until he could pay back all that he owed. This is how my heavenly Father will treat each of you unless you forgive your brother or sister from your heart. It's a powerful parable. There's a lot here. Let's go back and look at some of the details. Again, you have this king. He's settling accounts with people. He's got his record books. And he calls in this servant who owed him 10,000 bags of gold, it says in the NIV. Now, the literal words there in the Greek is 10,000 talents. But the problem is we don't know exactly what a talent was. I've heard all kinds of estimations about what it is. And, we're going to see, we do know what a denarii was. It was a day's wages. But what's a talent? And on the low end of the scale, just to put this in perspective, and again, it's as I look at some of them, it's really though, a talent is at least, it's made a weight of measure. So it could be a talent of gold or silver, and that's going to affect things. But it's at least a year's wages. At least a year's wages, and probably much, much more. I saw some things that said itself could be 10,000 years of a talent itself. So, but just even think of it that way. 10,000 years wages. That's how much he owes. Yeah, we don't know how, and how did he rack up that kind of bill? I don't know. Yeah, I mean, that's some pretty lavish living. But that's the point Jesus is making in a parable. It's the point he makes in other examples. He does something extreme. And so this man owed him 10,000, let's say, years' wages, and was brought to him. Since he was not able to pay, go figure, the master ordered that he and his wife and children and all he had be sold to repay the debt. Now, you aren't going to get that much for them. The highest you would get for a slave in that day, you sold someone in slavery, would be 1 talent. And that was extreme. So the whole family, 4 out of 10,000. You're not even close. They're not going to be able to repay it. It's not going to recover that. Well, the servant fell on his knees before him. Be patient with me, he begged, and I will pay back everything. The servant's master took pity on him, canceled the debt, and let him go. But when the servant went out, it says he found one of his fellow servants. Now, if you find something, what's that mean, at least in this setting? You were looking for it, doesn't it? He was looking for this servant who he knew owed him 100 silver coins, it says in the NIV. And again, literally it's 100 denarii. It's a day's wages. So still a decent amount of money, 100 days' wages, about a third of a year or so. That's pretty big. But compared to what he owed, that's what we need to keep in mind. Now, why was he looking for this guy? We don't know. Did it bring to mind, hey, okay, this whole settling accounts thing reminds me, this guy owes me, 100 denarii. Or was he trying to maybe recoup his, I'm going to find all the people who owe me money and, give it to the king and, give him, pay back toward what I owe him. We don't know, but he finds this man, one of his fellow servants, says he grabbed him and began to choke him. Notice that. He doesn't even walk up to him and ask, hey, that money. Immediately grabs him, begins to choke him. Pay back what you owe me, he demanded. The fellow servant fell to his knees and begged him, be patient with me and I will pay it back. Almost word for word what the first servant said to the king. Be patient with me and I will pay it back. And there's a chance he could pay it back. That would be possible, but he refused the first servant. Instead, he went off and had the man thrown into prison till he could pay the debt. Well, some other servants saw him, it says. They saw what had happened, and they knew what had happened with the king, and it says they were outraged. They couldn't imagine this. How can you do that in light of what just happened to you? And they went and they told their master everything. Then the master called in the servant. Look what he says, you wicked servant. Notice, he didn't call him wicked before. We don't know how he, again, ran up this debt of 10,000 years' wages. But you got to figure it wasn't to help his poor mother in the nursing home or, something like, oh, okay, I understand. I don't know. But he didn't call him wicked when he owed him all that. He calls him wicked now when he refuses to act the same way. And that's what he says. I canceled all that debt of yours. Shouldn't you have had mercy on your fellow servant just as I had on you? In anger, the master handed him over to the jailers to be tortured until he could pay back all he owed. Well, how long would it take you to pay back 10,000 years' wages? You wouldn't be able to. He's in there forever. This is how my heavenly Father will treat each of you unless you forgive your brother or sister from your heart. We're going to look at that verse in a little bit. But let's look at it. I think the key verse in this passage is verse 33. It's when the king says to this first servant, shouldn't you have had mercy on your fellow servant just as I had on you? Peter's asking, how often should we forgive? And he throws out the standard. He references at least the standard of the day. 3 times says, how about 7? Double it and add 1, Jesus. Jesus said, that's not the standard. The standard is God and his forgiveness. And the main idea today, the first one, there's a couple, because there's a couple distinct layers here. God's forgiveness of us demands our forgiveness of others. It's that simple. That is the standard. As much to the extent, to the degree God's forgiven you, that's the bar when you think of forgiving others. Well, you look here, how well do we do with that standard? As Christians, how well do we do? How many Christians have other people in prison, so to speak? And did you notice at the end of this parable, when the first servant gets thrown in jail, the second servant is still in jail? Ever notice that? The second servant is still in prison after the first servant threw him in. And you might think, well, the king's the king. He can get him out. And yeah, okay, don't stretch it. The rules of forgiveness certainly say, if someone does something to me and I don't forgive them, maybe God can forgive them their sins, but I'm the one that has to forgive whatever they've done to me, or they're in prison, so to speak. The relationship is broken. How many Christians, of us maybe, we have someone, they're in prison. That relationship is broken. Maybe I refuse to speak to them, refuse to be in the same room. Maybe I will, but there's just no real, and you move on. It is a broken relationship. We've got someone in prison. Or every time I look at this parable, I also think, maybe we don't have someone in prison because we're Christians, and so I can't. But we've got someone on parole. You know what parole is? This won't reflect upon anything in your past. If you say, oh, I know exactly what it is. But you know what parole is? It's where you do something, and either you get a limited sentence or no sentence, but you're on parole. You're out, you're free, but if you do anything else, it goes back, and your sentence is not just, you don't just get punished in accord for the thing you did later, it's also brings into account what you did before. That you get punished for all of it because you were on parole. It was sort of pending. It was conditional. Well, how many of us have people in our lives on parole? We talk to them and we get along with them and things are going fine, but when they do something, we reach back into their file and say, on September 3rd, 1999, you did this. Whatever we do, however we think about it, we treat them not just, the equivalent to what they've done there. We reach back, and we've got that past thing in mind too, and we're treating them in regard to that as well. How many of us have people on parole? Conditional relationship. And then, of course, you look at this parable, the first servant, he's not doing too well himself. At the end of the parable, again, he's in jail being tortured. Think about that. Think about how not forgiving someone affects us. What it does to us. I mean, you look at him here, he certainly didn't have peace, did he? He's out there, and it says, he looks for this person, and he finds him. What do you think he was like? You think he was all tense coming out of there? That's no way to live. It says in Hebrews 12:15, on your handout there, it says, see to it that no one fails to obtain the grace of God, that no root of bitterness springs up and causes trouble, and by it many become defiled. He talks about the need to forgive, and he says if you don't, it's going to poison the church. Well, other people as well, it's going to affect the unity of a church. It's certainly going to affect that person that's not forgiving. They're not going to escape that either. I've heard lack of refusing to forgive has been described as like drinking poison and waiting for the other person to die. I drink the poison and I wait for you to suffer. No, I'm the one that's going to suffer if I don't forgive. And this parable shows that as well. Well, whenever there's a story, sometimes even when it's a narrative, not a narrative passage, one of the epistles, but definitely stories, there's often a wait a minute moment. The problem is sometimes we're so familiar with the story that we don't like, wait a minute, because, we know how it turns out. It's not a surprise, like maybe if it was the first time we've heard it. But think about it, verses 29 to 30, you look at this, the fellow servant, after this first servant's been forgiven of 10,000 years' wages, finds the person who owes him 100 days, and it says in verse 29, his fellow servant fell to his knees and begged the first servant, be patient with me and I will pay it back. But he refused. Instead, he went off and had the man thrown into prison until he could pay the debt. Isn't that outrageous? How in the world? It just doesn't make sense. Again, that's why of course, we need to forgive the way God's forgiven us. And for this to happen, no. But it is possible for it to happen because people do it. We do it. We refuse to forgive. And again, maybe don't just think about, there's no one that I wouldn't, I couldn't be in the same room with. Maybe we don't have people in prison, but do we have them on parole? There's something we do there. We do these same things. Well, how do we do them? How can we know what we know and not just fully, completely, absolutely forgive someone? What's the root problem? Again, I think we know a lot of the details. There's nothing I've said. You need to forgive because God forgave you. No one is, wow, really? Didn't know that. What's the problem? And I think you see it in verses 23 and 27, really just the beginning of this parable. Look what happens here. Jesus says, "Therefore the kingdom of heaven is like a king who wanted to settle accounts with his servants. As he began the settlement, a man who owed him 10,000 bags of gold was brought to him. Since he was not able to pay, the master ordered that he and his wife and children, all that he had, be sold to repay his debt. At this, the servant fell down on his knees before him. 'Be patient with me,' he begged, 'and I will pay back everything.' Then the servant's master took pity on him, canceled the debt, and let him go." Did you notice something there? What did the servant ask for? Be patient with me and what? I'll pay back everything. That's what he asked for. He owed this king 10,000 talents of gold. 10,000 years' wages. You notice he didn't ask the king, please cancel my debt. He said, be patient with me and I'll pay it back. Was there any way he was going to be able to pay it back? No. But there also apparently was no way he could imagine asking someone, could you just write off that 10,000 talent debt I owe you? You know, even for a king, again, that's why Jesus makes it this amount. Even for a king, you know, for Bill Gates, this would be a huge amount. That's the point. He couldn't imagine, so he didn't ask for it. He did not say, please cancel my debt. He said, please be patient with me, and I will pay it back. He asked for a postponement, basically. And the king was settling accounts. He said, could you give me more time? But what did the king do? Verse 27, what did the king do? He forgave it. He canceled it. The king didn't say, okay, I'll give you more time. All right, you can have, because what could the king say? You can have 1,000 years? There's nothing the king could say. There's nothing that would fit. All right, yeah, well, no. So the king canceled the debt. The king pardoned him. Well, you look here, apparently the servant didn't realize that. When he went out, how could he go out then and find this other person and choke him and pay back what you owe me? Please give me more time. He refuses, throws him in jail. How could that be? Well, apparently he didn't realize. You know, did he forget? I don't know, it seems hard for me to imagine because it says then he went out. It wasn't even like a long period of time. Did he not apply it, not realize like, oh, okay, this happened to me. I should maybe do the same thing. The king certainly says, it just totally makes sense. Shouldn't you have done this? It shouldn't be a question. I'm wondering if he didn't hear what the king said in some sense, not just the audible sound waves, but he didn't understand it. He didn't accept it. Maybe he didn't believe it. Like, oh, you say that now, but always be held over me. Cancel this debt. I need to go find people who owe me money, pay you back. In whatever sense, he didn't get grace. For him to be able to go out then and find that person and choke him and pay back, he didn't get grace. Well, as Christians, we've been forgiven. We've been shown grace. This favor bestowed when wrath is owed. That's what we've been shown, but we don't always live like it, do we? We don't always live it out. And so I look at myself. Okay, do I forget about grace? You know, do I not apply it? I not realize that, oh, that thing we talk about, you know, communion, that fits here, you know, in my office at 3:03 when this person does that, and we don't apply it? I don't know. I think the root is, in whatever sense, we don't get grace. We don't fully get it. You know, because to me it just seems impossible to get it and then not forgive, not show that same grace. And so the key to overcoming whatever the specific root problem is we have to get grace. We have to get it and all its implications in our life. And as I thought about this sermon, and it's why I love this sermon, because it shows how important theology is, but it also reminds me how often I hear, oh, theology is not important. You know, and not just from, you know, regular people, at times from, you know, church leaders. Theology is not important. And like, you know, my response to that, important theology is important. Important theology is important. I will agree some theology is not important. Theology concerns every little detail. Some of it's not important. Paul said in 2 Timothy 2, refuse foolish and ignorant speculations, knowing that they produce quarrels. Don't just sit around and argue over little details that are just going to get you upset at each other. And it doesn't say exactly what that applies to, but I think some of it could be some theological details, some minutia. He says, don't. But you know what he says about grace? Galatians 1:6. Paul says, I'm astonished that you are so quickly deserting the one who called you to live in the grace of Christ and are turning to a different gospel, which is really no gospel, no good news at all. Evidently, some people are throwing you into confusion and are trying to pervert the gospel of Christ. But even if we, one of the apostles, or an angel from heaven should preach a gospel other than the one we preach to you, let them be under God's curse. As we have already said, so now I say it again, if anybody is preaching to you a gospel other than what you accepted, let them be under God's curse. The Message, I believe, in its loose way paraphrases that, let them go to hell. Because that's what it means to be under God's curse, is to spend eternity separate from God. Do you think Paul views grace a little differently than he does other theological details? Yeah. He's like, this you have to get. This is essential. This is important. We've got to realize the difference between this important theology of grace and some other things, and we've got to live accordingly. And you know what? I don't think we always do, and it's why people throw this stuff together. It's like, theology is not important. It reminds me, when I was in seminary, I had a class one semester on grace, and it was the second hour of the day. First hour of the day, there was a class on the end times. When will Jesus come back, the details, the rapture, the this, the beast, all this stuff, all these details. During the break, during second hour, I didn't have the first class. A lot of people in the second hour grace class had the first one as well. During the break, the people who had the first class would sit around and discuss the first class. I'm like, we're in the middle of grace class here. This is the one that is absolutely essential, and you guys are arguing, really, not just discussing the details from the first class. Not saying it's not important, that some details of that, but it just blew my mind. Like, this is the one that's day to day, that we know, that we need to get and see how it fits in. And sometimes we don't. I heard the phrase once, everyone is a theologian. If I were to ask you, I should have done that. Next time, mark that down. How many here are a theologian? Pretend I didn't say that. Strike that, rewind the tape. There we go. They'll never know. Most people, regular church people, I'm not a theologian. No, everyone's a theologian. You're either a good theologian or a bad theologian. Theology just means I've got an idea of what this means in the Bible. We've all got an idea. Is the idea good or bad? And when it comes to grace, we've got to have a good theology. We've got to get grace. And the main idea, the second one today that goes to this deeper level, is grasping God's grace will empower us to show grace to others. But we've got to grasp it. We've got to know it. We've got to understand it. And so I put there on your sheet a little Grace 101. I want to make sure we get the basics of grace. And I did put there regarding justification aspect of grace. You realize, and I asked this question, you guys always know, sin has really three effects. The two effects of sin that we often talk about, what are they? Sinfulness, guilt, guilt, sinfulness, and then physical death. We don't often mention that. Well, salvation covers all three of those. Forgiveness covers guilt, transformation covers sinfulness, and then the resurrection is going to cover physical death. Well, the Bible, or the technical word for forgiveness, is justification. So that's the side of grace we're talking about, because it does apply to transformation too. We are changed by God's power too. But today let's talk about how we're forgiven and why we need it. You look there, that diagram about God. God's moral nature has two sides. And we're all familiar with his love, and we love that side. We love his love. But there's his holiness too. And if you were to look at God's moral attributes, they all stem from one of these two, his love or his holiness. His moral attributes, not his omnipotence and omniscience, but his kindness, his patience, his wrath, we're going to see, all come from one or the other. Well, God's holiness is his separateness from sin. Not just God can't do it, he can't leave it unpunished and just overlook it. He's got to be totally separate. His love, which is interesting, I thought about love. That's the one that's so simple. I'm like, well, how do you define his love? Love. What is love? His benevolent goodness, kindness to us. That's God's love. And at first, before sin entered the picture, things are pretty easy. God's holiness gives us law. It gives us principles for living based on God's nature. God is truth, don't lie. God is life, don't murder. And God's love gives us blessings, and life is great. But what happens when sin enters the picture? Well, when sin enters the picture, God's holiness says, I can't just overlook it. You deserve punishment. And God's love says, I don't want this relationship to be broken forever. I want to restore this relationship. And so his love turns into grace in the presence of sin. And how does grace work? Well, I put a couple other diagrams down there. Personal active righteousness on the one side, declared passive righteousness on the other. Righteousness means conformity to a standard. Am I righteous? Well, do I match the standard? And in our case, the standard is God's righteousness, his holiness. Am I as good, as sinless as God in one sense? Well, you've got two ways to look at that. You notice the personal active righteousness. That's as it says, my personal righteousness, it's me. How have I lived? If you were to add up all the good things I've done and subtract all the bad things I've done and subtract the good things I should have done but I didn't do, that's where you would find that personal active righteousness level. Somewhere between 0 and 100. No one's at 100 because all have sinned. I don't know if anyone's at 0. Can you be totally 0? I probably was a little generous there, though, on the levels. Those are some pretty good people, I think. You really think about what God's standard is versus us. But that's the point. No one's at 100. That's my level of goodness, badness scale. But then there's the declared passive righteousness. And declared means God views me this way, and it's passive. It's not how many good things, bad things have you done. It's do you owe a penalty or not. And if you don't owe a penalty, you're 100% passively righteous. And if you do owe a penalty, you're 0%. There is no other alternative. You're either 100% or 0. Well, here's the thing to get about grace. Justification, forgiveness, dealing with the guilt of our sin is not making up the difference when it comes to our personal active righteousness. God doesn't come to you and say, Carol, you're at 67%. That means, I should have picked an easier number. 33, thank you, Mark. That means you need 33% more grace, righteousness, and that'll get you up to the 100% you need to be. That is not how justification works. That is not how that side of grace works at all. That's not how we're forgiven. We're forgiven when we receive Christ's passive righteousness. Jesus died on the cross to pay the price for sins, to pay the penalty that we owed. He did it for everyone. His death equaled the eternity in hell for every person who's ever lived. And anyone who becomes a Christian, what that means is to be forgiven is to receive 100% passive righteousness. I was at 0. I had 0. I owed the penalty. The same penalty everyone else owed, eternal separation from God. One sin equals that, because God's 100% holy. I received it, you received it. Anyone that's become a Christian has received 100% passive righteousness. Now, why does it matter? Why does it matter? Well, let me ask you why it matters. Why does it matter? If I'm saved anyway... Because I say that about the end times. Again, here we are in the grace. Those guys who were in the end times class, I'm like, you know what? I'm not sure it matters. Whatever happens, if Jesus comes and there's a rapture, I'm going. If there's no rapture, if he just the trumpet and it's over, I'm hearing the trumpet. In one sense, it doesn't matter. Okay, what if someone looked at me and said, come on, Steve, this theology stuff. Am I saved? Am I going to heaven? Yeah, if you accept him, you are. What's it matter? This one's not just rhetorical. What's it matter whether you understand between those two elements of how we're saved? The one on the left, if you thought we're saved by Jesus making up the difference of our active rights, I've lived this good of a life, Jesus made up the difference, whew, now I'm going to heaven. What could that lead to? Could lead to some works. Could lead to an idea of grace that includes works. Yeah, it could lead to, why could it lead to works? It's all about us, and what if we're a little,
And we're better than everyone because we're at 100%. So it's kind of like what the leaders that were giving when Jesus came. They were 100%.
They thought they were 100%, and so they looked down. Yeah, if you misunderstand grace, I've always said there will be one of two effects. You'll either be prideful because you think you're better than someone else and needed less grace, or you'll be shameful because you think you're worse than someone else and needed more grace. Again, when you define grace as making up that difference. The other thing is it may lead to a works mentality because you might think God's got some bare minimum, and I'm not sure I'm there. They're like, surely God's not going to get, I got to at least attain 25% on my own. And I had a pretty bad high school experience. I'm not sure where I am. I got to do a lot of things because, he's not going to give more than 75. I've got to do my part. And so it could lead to that. If you think you only needed 10% grace, how much are you going to, what's going to be your attitude toward grace, toward God, toward what he did for you, compared to maybe someone who needed, who realized they needed 100%, who did the right thing? Remember Jesus said to someone, he who has been forgiven little loves little. He's been forgiven much, loves much. And the point is, if you understand the passive righteousness, who's been forgiven little? No one. If you truly understand the way it's supposed to be. Now, the first people think they've been forgiven. Yeah, I was forgiven about 15%. That's how appreciative I am to God. God, I'm appreciative for 15% of grace. That's what you gave me, so I'm that appreciative. But if you understand it, I'm 100% appreciative because I needed 100% grace. And again, you're going to work it in. You're going to maybe, going back to that idea, if I think I have to work for God's grace, or I have to work to get the bare minimum, or even, sometimes you take it a different way. It's like, okay, I get 100% grace from God, but to do it, I've got to be so good. And you sort of mix the two scales together. Well, if I think I've got to work for God's grace and forgiveness, what is that likely to do in me toward others? They've got to work. Listen, I'm doing what I need to do to get God's forgiveness. You aren't getting off for free. This is how the grace stuff works. I know it. I'm working hard to get God's forgiveness. Show a little effort to me here, and I'll give you my forgiveness. If you don't understand grace, it's going to affect everything. It's going to affect everything and how we live and what we do. And one misunderstanding of grace that I came across twice a week, and I've debated, and even now, do I bring it up? Do I not bring it up? But I've seen it a couple times, and things are just so easy nowadays with Facebook. Someone has a link to some article by a religious guy, and you read it, and I've seen this wrong idea about grace. It's funny. It's an old idea that's coming back. And it's the idea that Jesus didn't die on the cross to forgive our sins, to pay the price. Everything I've just said, it denies it. And it basically says, and this one's by Brian McLaren, and I don't know if you've seen any of his books or not. He's part of what's called the Emerging Church, and they had some great ideas for a while, and then they just went wacko. Rob Bell would be part of that movement. The Pneuma guy who started off good and wacko, and the Wild at Heart guy, John Eldridge, he's in that group. But here's what he said in this article. He says, most Christians think Jesus died on the cross, pay our penalty for sin. How different it is if we believe the greatest existential threat to human beings, again, the thing that's really that we're in danger of, is human evil itself. Not God's wrath. That's not what we have to worry about because I've sinned. Human evil itself: violence, greed, lust, fear, pride, anger, superiority, hate, malice, apathy, haste, rage, etc. If that's the case, then God enters into the picture. Jesus came to earth as one trying to save us from the destructive effects of our own evil. He's trying to keep us from messing up our lives. God is not our greatest threat, but rather our greatest hope. God is not violent in nature and does not inflict harm, but rather is the model of nonviolence, forgiveness, reconciliation, pardon, grace, and kindness, inviting our imitation. That sounds just close enough to be dangerous, doesn't it? Should we imitate God? Yes. Is God violent by nature? No. But what he's saying is the cross was not about paying the penalty for sin. And ultimately, he says, when you believe that, then you believe there's lost and saved, and he denies that. Everyone's saved. He says, when he talks about this, and now anyone that still believes in that, that old-fashioned theory of Jesus paid the penalty for our sin, first thing they're going to say when you say this to them, that, oh no, Jesus came to save us from ourselves, they're going to say, yeah, but Jesus is the one who paid the penalty. He paid it for us. And the response to that is, how can justice and mercy be achieved through an act of injustice? If God is just, how can an innocent person be punished? Who's the innocent person he's talking about? Jesus, exactly. He says, that's unjust. We sin, Jesus pays for it, and God says, this is how you know my justice? By an unjust act? What do you say to that? How do you answer him? It would be. Was it unjust for Jesus to pay the price for our sins?
If he was forced, maybe.
There you go. If you were to use the analogy of a person committing a crime, and the judge says, I find you guilty, Mark, of committing this crime. Your punishment is whatever, 50 years or life. And so, let me see. Tori, you're the one who's going to pay his penalty. You didn't do it. I absolutely know you didn't do it. You don't want to pay the penalty. You're the one to pay. That would be unjust. But if I, as the judge, find Mark guilty and says, Mark, you absolutely deserve the punishment, but I'm going to take it for you. That's not unjust then. If I'm the one who's willingly choosing to do it, and then in the big picture, God's the one himself, Jesus, takes the penalty. So again, that's something that's out there that undermines grace, and you're going to hear it. And if we don't get grace, it's going to affect everything. How we view things, certainly how we forgive, as this parable is talking about. But when we understand grace, and specifically today this justification, how am I really forgiven? What's the mechanics of it? And you know what? We need to understand the mechanics, but then we also even deeper need to understand the love behind it. God's grace, it's why I put that first chart up there. God's grace flows from his love. It's not just how he did it, it's why he did it. Why did God forgive me? Because he loves me. And I sin over and over, and he loves me. And I sin again, and he loves me. And that doesn't make grace an excuse for sin. I read something else that was great. The problem with grace isn't that we think about it too much and say, oh, okay, I can do whatever I want. It's that we think about it too little, and we don't get it. Boy, if we think about it a lot, it's going to motivate us to live for God in every way. It's going to motivate us to forgive people, as this parable's talking about, not to have them in prison, not to have relationships that are totally broken, not to have them on parole, just waiting to bring up, oh, yeah, it's just not today. You did that too. It's not just I know I should forgive, I'll be able to forgive. That's the difference too. I know I should forgive, but grace enables me to forgive. I had a script. I still pray that something could come of this because it's such an amazing story about the Christian couple who were caught up in the Muslim violence in Indonesia, and her family, her mother-in-law, son were killed by the radical Muslims. She was taken captive, forced to marry a man, have a child, tortured her and her daughter, just all this stuff. She eventually got free, and she couldn't forgive them at first. She lived a Christian life her whole life. Christian done what she was supposed to do, but she couldn't forgive them. And it finally came down to she was trying to forgive them just because she knew she should. And that wasn't enough. Up to that point, she'd been able to live her Christian life doing what I'm supposed to do. I know I'm supposed to do it, so I'll do it. But she got to this, and that wasn't enough. That external, rule wasn't enough. But grace came alive in her, and she realized just what Christ had done for her. And that's what enabled her to forgive. So grace doesn't just tell us you better forgive. Grace enables us to forgive when we get it. And grace impacts all of life. It's not just forgiveness. I was talking with someone this week. Grace is the essence of I don't get what I deserve. And how often in life are we thinking, I want what I deserve. I deserve this. Well, if you had to have it, do you want everything you deserve or nothing? Because everything would mean eternal separation from God. Grace puts it in perspective. You know what? Anything you get you don't deserve, be thankful. Because you deserve eternal separation. And if you're a believer, you don't have that coming. And grace gives us peace. I can live this life with peace. Again, I think about this person and this first servant. He went out and he found the man. He was just figure how clinched he was. I'm going to find this guy who owes me. That's how he was going through life. And I've seen a lot of Christians. That's how they go through life. There's no peace. They aren't relaxed. But the Bible says in Romans, therefore, since we have been justified through faith, we have peace with God. I don't have to worry about him. Why? Because Romans 8:1 says, therefore, there's no condemnation. God's not looking at me and holding something over my head. He said, you are absolutely forgiven. Don't worry about it. Don't worry about it. Well, I do want to deal with that last verse. We talked about it in Bible study. It was interesting. In verse 35, this is how my heavenly Father will treat each of you unless you forgive your brother or sister from your heart. And remember the question came up. That sounds a little bit like works, doesn't it? You don't forgive someone, you don't go to heaven. So I have to do something to get into heaven. That sounds like works. Remember we said first you have to define a work. What's a work? It's something I do in obedience to God's principles, his law. The thing that sets works apart is, am I doing it to be saved, a works of the law, to earn salvation? Or am I doing it because I'm saved, an act of gratitude for God's grace? Yeah, it's a work. I'm supposed to be kind, supposed to not be angry, supposed to forgive, all these things. But I'm not earning God's salvation. Someone has said, grace is not opposed to effort, to me doing things. It's opposed to earning. I don't earn salvation, but God does expect me to live the Christian life. The problem here, why Jesus is saying this, again, it's not some level of works. It's not if you're not at 51%, if you're not at 75%. It's if you don't have a commitment to God. And he's saying here, you can't be receiving grace if you absolutely refuse to show it. You've not received it. It's not that I'm looking at you and saying, oh, you're not good enough. You haven't gotten it. You haven't made that foundational commitment that says, God, I surrender my life to you. I won't be perfect. I know it. You know it. But I'm surrendered to you. You're saying, God, I'm not surrendered to you. I'll give you all my life except this one area. I am not forgiving. Definitely not that person. God says, well, then you haven't committed. I'm not looking at you and measuring your works and saying you fell one work short. I'm saying you never committed in the first place. You never surrendered in the first place. Forgiveness doesn't earn grace, but refusing to forgive rejects grace. And remember we said Tuesday night, I'd never thought of it this way, but I think it applies. It's a little bit like the Pharisees, where Jesus talked about blasphemy against the Holy Spirit won't be forgiven. Why? What was blasphemy? It's like they knew Jesus was doing works through the power of God. He was casting out demons through the power of God, and what they tell the people? He's doing it through the power of Satan. Those Pharisees were jeopardizing the salvation of these people. Well, think about it. If I live my life and say, I'm a Christian saved by grace, and then totally refuse to forgive the essence of grace, other people see that and like, that's what Christianity is? No thanks. Now, does that mean we have to be perfect? Absolutely not. And you will all often hear people say, oh, those Christians are hypocrites. 9 out of 10 times may be an excuse. They're just using it to keep from facing the facts themselves. But if I ever just say, I refuse to live by God's principles, refuse to do it, not going to do it, God, not going to live the way you want me to do, don't care the impact that has, that's me saying, God, I don't care that I'm the one who's supposed to be spreading this good news, and anyone that I'm coming in contact with, I'm basically contaminating. That's what God's saying. We don't have to be perfect, but we have to be committed to him. All right, what do I need to do? How do we take this home? I think the first thing all of us need to do, and hopefully you've been doing it as we've gone, in terms of forgiveness, ask yourself, do I have anyone in prison? Is there anyone where the relationship really isn't one? Either I refuse to see them, talk to them, or we're in the same room, but there's no doubt there's hostility there, and I'm not doing anything to resolve it? Or do I have anyone that's on parole? We get along and we talk and we're fine until they do something, and then I bring back everything. I may not bring it up to them, remember what you did, but in my mind, I remember what you did. And you know what? I think the biggest place this comes into play sometimes is families, people that we're the closest to. Those are the ones that we're tempted to bring back those things. And so we need to ask, have I truly forgiven? And then ask about grace. What do I understand about grace? If I don't get it, I need to. It's not just like the end times. I'm sorry, some people, they're just so important. I've never found two people to totally even agree on all the details of that. It's not life or death, but grace is. What do I understand about it? How often do I think about it? How well do I apply it? I was talking with someone this week, and they said, wouldn't it be cool if you could like develop a little catchphrase like grace check? And you'd be in the middle of something and you say, I need a grace check. Am I living like the Son of God died for me and I've accepted it? And maybe if you really want to get bold and risky, you allow someone else to say to you, grace check.
You also have the Holy Spirit to give us a grace check.
He is, yeah. He's trying to. And if we don't understand grace, he's not got any power. Grace check, like, oh yeah, working during God's favor, got it. So you got to understand what grace is to get the grace check. But yeah, he's trying to, if we'd allow someone else, and there's that growth triangle. We get the truth in the Word, the Holy Spirit is working in situations, and other people, if we'd allow them, and again, yeah, you want to be bold, I challenge you, allow someone else to say to you, grace check. Allow your husband or wife, allow a close friend, allow a family member that you're in contact with often. What will it look like? Well, how would your life be different if you were really living by grace in your relationships and just in your life? I thought about this myself. I think I'm closer than I was, but what will it look like to live that out? It does for you. That's the whole point. The freedom of grace is why Paul's so upset in Galatians, because they aren't free. Well, what is there as we start to live it out? I wanted to leave this one open because I didn't want to assume that I'll ask the right question. What do you have? Is there something about grace? How's this fit?